She dropped a court document on the most dangerous man in Montreal, and the only thing he said was, "You missed a page." Have you ever walked into a room and felt the air change before anyone looked at you? Not the nervous kind of change. The kind that means something has already been decided and no one told you yet. That was Norah on a Tuesday in November, standing in the lobby of Voss and Partners, with a manila folder pressed against her chest and water dripping off her coat onto the marble floor because the drainage outside the building was broken and the city had been promising to fix it since August. She was not supposed to be there. Her supervisor at the legal aid clinic had sent her because the actual paralegal, a man named Patrick who smelled faintly of toner and resentment, had called in sick. The file needed to be hand-delivered, signature required. Do not leave it at reception. Do not make eye contact with the partners. Do not take longer than 15 minutes. She made it 11 before everything went sideways. The man she was supposed to deliver to was Marcus Dre, junior partner, office on the 4th floor. She had confirmed this before leaving. She had written it on her hand in blue pen because her phone battery was at 6%, and she had learned not to trust that number after the 3rd time it had lied to her. What nobody had told her, because nobody at the clinic moved in circles where this information was necessary, was that Marcus Dre's office had been reassigned 3 weeks prior. The 4th floor now belonged to one person, Killian Voss. The name meant something in Montreal in the way that weather meant something. You did not need to be interested in it for it to affect your life. His father had built the company. His grandfather had built half the old port district. What Killian had built was harder to describe in polite company, though everyone agreed the buildings were very clean. Norah did not know any of this when she stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor and walked directly into a meeting she had not been invited to. The room was glass-walled on 2 sides. 8 men sat around a long table that cost more than her rent for the year. Norah realized this the same moment she realized she had opened the wrong door. Nobody moved. Killian Voss sat at the head of the table with a coffee cup in one hand and a look on his face that suggested the last person who interrupted this meeting was now somewhere colder than Montreal in November. He was younger than she expected, though she had not expected anyone specifically because she had not expected to be here at all. Dark hair, jacket on. The kind of stillness that was not calm but choice. He looked at her the way people look at something unexpected that has not yet decided whether it is a problem. Norah held up the folder. She said, "I'm looking for Marcus Dre." The room waited. Killian set down his coffee. "Marcus is on 3. The woman at reception said 4. The woman at reception," he said evenly, "is covering for someone who quit on Friday." Norah looked at the folder, then at the table, then at the 8 men who had all stopped pretending not to stare. She said, "I also may have dropped some of these in the elevator." She had 3 pages when the folder had caught on her jacket button as the doors opened. She had grabbed most of them, but the numbering had not survived the rescue attempt. One of the men at the table started to say something that sounded like the beginning of a dismissal. Killian spoke first. "You missed a page." He nodded at the document she was holding. The corner of page 7 was visible, sitting between page 12 and what she now realized was a photocopy of something entirely unrelated that had gotten in there at the clinic. Second shelf on the left. "There's a stapler." She stood very still. "I'm sorry, fix the document before you go downstairs. It will save you a second trip." It was not kindness exactly. It was practicality wearing a calm face, but it moved through the room like something stranger because nobody in a room like that spoke to a wet courier like she was someone worth speaking to at all. Norah walked to the shelf, found the stapler, reassembled the document in silence with 8 men watching, and did not let her hands shake until she was back in the elevator. Marcus Dre signed for the folder 12 minutes later without looking up from his phone. She was back outside in the rain by noon. She thought about it for approximately 40 minutes, then filed it under Strange Tuesday and went back to work. The clinic where she worked occupied the ground floor of a former pharmacy on St. Hubert. The sign outside needed new letters. The waiting room had 4 chairs and a plant that Norah watered every Monday because no one else remembered, and it had survived this long through a combination of her effort and what she chose to believe was stubbornness. Her job was intake. People came in with problems they did not know how to name yet, and she helped them find the right words before they saw anyone who could actually help. It was not glamorous. It paid enough for her 1 bedroom in Rosemont, and the monthly call to her mother in Halifax, and the occasional book she did not strictly need but bought anyway. It was hers. That part mattered more than she usually admitted. She heard the name Killian Voss again 4 days later. from her colleague Serge, who followed Montreal real estate the way other people followed hockey. "They're saying he's buying the Lejoie building," Serge said, eating a sandwich over his keyboard with the confidence of a man who had never met a stain he could not blame on someone else. "The whole block, basically. Port District." Norah was entering case notes and did not look up. "Who is Voss? Junior Voss, the son." She paused. "What does he do with the buildings after?" Serge shrugged. "Depends who you ask. If you ask the business section, he develops them. If you ask the people who used to live in them." He made a gesture that meant he did not want to finish the sentence in a legal aid clinic. Norah went back to her notes. She was not thinking about Killian Voss. She was thinking about the Lejoie block, which she passed on the way to her bus stop, where there was a laundrette and a dépanneur and an older woman named Gerta, who had been there since before the neighborhood had a reputation either direction. She thought about Gerta the same way she had thought about the stapler. Practical, unresolvable, filed away. The second time she saw him was at the market on a Saturday. Jean Talon was loud the way markets are loud, which is to say full of specific sounds rather than general noise. Cheese being wrapped, someone arguing politely in Haitian Creole about tomatoes, a child explaining at length to an indifferent dog why dogs were not allowed inside. Norah was buying eggs and thinking about whether she could afford the good bread or only the acceptable bread, when she turned and found Killian Voss standing 2 feet away, holding a bunch of leeks, with the focused attention of a man who had never bought leeks before and was not going to admit that. He recognized her first. "You work at the legal clinic," he said. Not a question. Norah looked at the leeks, then at him. "You know where I work? My assistant filed the documents you delivered. Your clinic's name is on the header." He paused. "The stapler is still on the shelf." She did not know what to do with that, so she bought the acceptable bread instead of the good bread while she decided. "I hope the meeting wasn't disrupted." It was. Everyone survived. There was something in the way he said it that she could not quite categorize. Not warmth and not coldness. Something that had learned to live between the two and had been there long enough that it looked like a personality. She looked at the leeks again. "You're going to need butter if you're doing something serious with those." He glanced down. "What constitutes serious?" "Anything that isn't just boiling them and hoping." The market moved around them. Someone bumped her shoulder with a basket. She stepped sideways. He did not move at all, which she noticed, and then noticed that she had noticed, which was the beginning of a problem she did not identify as one yet. "Killian Voss," he said, which she already knew, and extended his hand. "Norah," she shook it. His grip was careful. Careful in the way of someone who had learned that careful was safer than instinct. He bought the butter. She did not see him again until he called the clinic. It was a Wednesday, 3 weeks later. The call came in on the main line and went to intake, which was her. The man on the other end said he was calling on behalf of Voss and Partners regarding a community consultation they were conducting for the Lejoie development. He said the firm wanted to connect with local service organizations. He asked if someone from the clinic would be available to meet. Norah took the message. She did not tell anyone that she had met the man whose name was at the top of the letterhead, or that he had bought butter at Jean Talon, or that she still thought about the stapler more than was reasonable. Her director sent her to the meeting. The boardroom at Voss and Partners was on the 3rd floor this time. Norah arrived 5 minutes early and sat across from 2 men she did not recognize and one she did. Killian did not acknowledge that they had met before, which told her something. She did not acknowledge it either, which she suspected told him something back. The meeting was about community impact. The development team presented plans. Norah asked questions about displacement, about timeline, about what happened to existing tenants during construction. The 2 men answered with the fluency of people who had answered those questions many times in rooms where the answers were never really examined. Killian did not answer those questions. He watched her ask them. Afterward, when the 2 men had left to take calls, he stayed. "You already know about Gerta," he said. Norah looked up from her notepad. "Who told you about Gerta?" "You did. You looked at the building plans when Renaud put them on the screen. Your expression changed at the Lejoie South corner." She set down her pen. "Her family has been in that unit for 31 years. I know. The plans show that unit as a commercial conversion. I know that too." She watched him for a moment. "Then why are you doing the consultation if you already know what the problems are?" He was quiet for long enough that it stopped feeling like hesitation and started feeling like a choice. "Because I was told to know the answers before I walked in," he said, "not to find them here." That was either an admission or a performance. Norah had spent enough time at intake to know the difference usually depended on what happened next. She picked up her pen. Gerda's lease is protected under provincial tenure rules. Your legal team would have found that already. They did. Then, you don't need me to tell you? No, Killian said. I didn't. He left before she could decide what he meant. She took the long way home past the Lejoy block and stood outside the laundrette for a moment looking at the lights in the upper windows. Gerda's had a yellow curtain. It was still there. She told herself the meeting had been productive. Then she checked the lock on her door when she got home for no reason she could name. The third time she met him, she had not been planning to see him at all. Her friend Danny had dragged her to a fundraiser for a legal literacy organization in a restored space near the old canal. The kind of event where the wine cost more than her grocery budget, and the conversations were careful in the way of people who were measuring each other. Norah wore a dress she had owned for 4 years and shoes that had survived 2 previous events and would survive this one. Danny disappeared within 20 minutes to talk to someone she knew from law school. Norah stood near the edge of the room with a glass of water and did what she always did in rooms like this, which was calculate the exits and find the one least likely to require apology. Killian was across the room talking to a man in a gray suit. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do with her face. She chose neutral. He crossed the room. You're not drinking the wine, he said. I'm working tomorrow. It's Thursday. My Thursday starts at 7. He looked at her glass. Water before midnight seems like a political statement. I contain multitudes. The words came out before she could stop them. Something shifted in his expression that she might have called amusement if she had been willing to commit to the observation. They moved to the side of the room without agreeing to. The way people do when the conversation has weight and the center of a room is not the right place for weight. He told her about the development, not the boardroom version, the version underneath where his father had started the project 12 years ago with partners whose names no longer appeared in any public document because the city had gotten quieter about certain things and louder about others. Killian had inherited the project when he inherited the firm. He had spent 3 years trying to understand which parts of it could be built cleanly and which could not. And the Lejoy block? She asked. Can be done right, he said. If I control what right means. Do you? Not entirely. He looked toward the window where canal lights moved on dark water. Not yet. She had no reason to believe him. She believed the facts he presented because facts were verifiable. But she believed the something underneath them too, which was different, and she was honest enough with herself to find that unsettling. I'm not going to stop asking questions, she said. I know. He turned back to her. That's why I wanted you in the meeting. Norah stared at him. You asked for me specifically. I asked for a representative from the clinic who would read the plans before arriving and ask about the tenants by name. How did you know I'd do that? Because you reassembled a court document in front of 8 people without explaining yourself, he said, and you checked whether the plant on your desk was watered before you left the clinic last Tuesday. She went very still. You've been to the clinic. I drove past it. That's not an answer. He gave her a look that was not an apology and not a deflection. It was the look of a man who knew exactly where the line was, because he had spent years learning where other men had drawn it wrong. I drove past it, he said again quietly. Once. She went home with Danny, who wanted to know everything and got very little. That night Norah sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her cat, a large, disapproving tabby named after a Halifax street she had grown up on, pressing his forehead against her knee. She thought about dangerous men. She had grown up adjacent to one. Her father had not been Mafia. He had been smaller and more ordinary than that, which in some ways made him harder to explain to herself. She had learned early that the men who looked the most like danger were sometimes not, and the men who looked the least like it sometimes were, and the only reliable indicator she had found was what happened when you told them no. She had not told Killian Voss no about anything yet. She filed that away. Then she made tea and went to bed and spent the next 2 weeks not thinking about him in ways that occupied a great deal of her attention. He did not call. He did not send anything to the clinic. The development's community liaison reached out once to confirm a second meeting date, which Norah attended, and in which Killian sat at the far end of the table and asked her exactly 2 questions, both about provincial tenure regulations, both in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer and wanted to hear how she explained it. Gerda's unit appeared on the revised plans as a protected residential lease. Norah noticed. She did not say anything in the meeting. On the way out in the elevator, she said quietly to the space in front of her, "The south corner changed." Killian, standing beside her, said, "The tenure rules were very clear. They were clear the first time too." "Yes," he said, "they were." The elevator opened. She walked out. He did not follow. She was 2 blocks away before she admitted to herself that she had wanted him to. The problem with Killian Voss was not that he was dangerous. She had accepted that early and filed it properly. The problem was that he was dangerous the way an old building is dangerous. Not because it wants to fall on you, but because it has been holding too much weight for too long, and the effort shows in the wrong places, and you cannot look at it without understanding both what it was built to be and what it has had to survive. Her friend Danny did not find this romantic. "You're describing a liability?" Danny said over phone on a Friday that felt like it had lasted 4 days. "With cheekbones. I'm not describing anything. I'm explaining a metaphor. The metaphor is a man who knows where you work, Norah. He drove past it once, that you know of." Norah wound noodles around her spoon. Danny was not wrong. She was also not entirely right. There was a difference between surveillance and attention, and Norah had learned to read the difference. Though she acknowledged this was not a skill most people would be comforted to know she had developed. "He revised the plans," she said. Danny looked at her. "For Goethe. For the regulation. The regulation was always there, but he changed it after talking to you." Norah said nothing. Danny picked up her spoon. "I'm going to say something. You are going to dismiss it immediately, but I need you to hear it first." She waited until Norah looked up. Men like that don't change plans for regulations. They change plans for reasons. The call came on a Monday morning at 6:53, not from Killian. From a man who identified himself as representing a company Norah did not recognize, whose voice had the particular flatness of someone reading from a script that had been written by someone angrier than he was. He said that her ongoing involvement in the LaJoie consultations was creating difficulties for the development timeline. He said that her clinic's continued representation of tenants in the South Block was being noted. He used the word noted twice. He suggested that it might be in the best interests of everyone if the clinic redirected its focus to cases more clearly within its mandate. Norah wrote it down, every word. She did this because she was good at her job, and her job had taught her that the second piece of paper was always more important than the first. Then she called her director, who called their board counsel, who said it sounded like intimidation, but was phrased carefully enough to be legally ambiguous. Then she called Killian Voss. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Someone called me this morning." A pause. Not surprise. Something that had already been expecting the sentence. "When?" 6:53. "They said my involvement in the consultation was creating difficulties." His voice dropped a degree. "Who called?" He gave a company name I don't recognize. I wrote it down. Ralt Development Services. Silence that had weight. "Killian. I know that company," he said, and the way he said it told her everything about who had sent the call before he told her anything. "That name is not connected to Voss and Partners. Not officially, but unofficially. My father had investors," he said carefully, "whose relationship with the firm I have spent 3 years attempting to conclude. And they're not finished being concluded. No, flat, contained, they are not." Norah sat with her notepad in front of her, the name in blue ink, the time. "The exact phrasing," she said. "They think I'm a lever. Yes, are they right?" The pause this time was different, longer. The kind of pause that meant the answer was complicated in a way that mattered. "They think that what I do next depends on what they do to you," he said. "They want to test whether that's true. And is it?" "Yes," he said. And then, quieter, "That makes you a target. I'm sorry." She sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something that doesn't fit your existing categories and requires a new one. Then she said, "I need you to tell me everything. Not the boardroom version," he told her. It took 40 minutes and a second cup of coffee she did not drink. The investors from his father's era had money in 3 of the development's subcontractors. They were skimming through inflated invoices and structuring the payments to stay under reporting thresholds. They were not losing much, but they were losing their arrangement with the firm now that Killian was unwinding his father's partnerships, and they wanted to slow him down. Discrediting the consultation, creating conflict with community organizations, making the project look contested. All of it created delays, and delays created leverage. "They're doing it through the paperwork," Norah said. Yes, she thought about this. She had seen something like it before in a much smaller form, in a case at the clinic involving a landlord and a housing cooperative. Not Mafia, just a man who understood that the least violent form of control was the form that made other people do the work for him. "Can I see the subcontractor files?" she asked. Killian was quiet. "I'm not going to use them against you," she said. "I'm going to look at the numbers. You're an intake coordinator at a legal aid clinic. I have a degree in forensic accounting that I have not finished explaining to anyone who asks." She let that sit. "I work intake because it was the only position open when I moved to Montreal 2 years ago, and I am apparently very patient." A long silence then. "I'll have Renaud send them." She spent the next 4 evenings at her kitchen table with the files on her laptop and her cat sitting in the way. The numbers were not subtle once you knew what to look for. Payments just under 10,000. Different vendor names, same formatting errors in the tax ID lines. Addresses that led to shared postal boxes, and one memorably to a storage unit near Laval that appeared to be registered to a man who had died the previous spring. She built a map of it, not the way a lawyer would. The way someone who had spent 3 years cataloging the small and specific ways that paperwork was used to hurt people would. By the 3rd evening, she had linked 2 shell companies back to a numbered holding, registered in the name of a man called Goth, which was not a name Killian had mentioned, but whose number appeared in the corner of 4 separate vendor invoices in a way that looked accidental and was not. She called Killian at 10:15 at night. He answered in the same voice he used in boardrooms. She said, "There's a holding company you didn't tell me about." "Silence. Gauthier," she said. "Numbered corporation, registered in Ontario. It's the shared vendor for your concrete supplier and your freight carrier, and at least 2 of the consulting invoices your legal team signed off on." Longer silence. "How did you find that? The tax ID lines all have the same extra space before the last 4 digits." She waited. "It's a habit. Someone did the original registration and then used the same template every time. People change names. They forget habits." He exhaled slowly. "Gauthier is my father's lawyer." She closed her eyes for a second. "He's been skimming from inside." "For how long? Based on what I have, at least 2 years." She paused. "Killian, this is not just the investors. This is someone who knows your books well enough to build a frame around you from the inside. If the city inspector comes and flags those invoices as Voss connected, the whole project looks contaminated." His voice was controlled in the way of something that had not decided yet what shape the anger was going to take. "And I look like my father?" "Yes." The line was quiet. Montreal outside her window was doing what Montreal did at 10:15 on a Wednesday, which was exist with tremendous conviction regardless of what was happening inside anyone's apartment. She said, "I can finish the map by tomorrow. But then you have to decide what to do with it." "I know what to do with it." "I mean legally," she said. "You go to council. You do a voluntary disclosure to the appropriate authority. You do not call Gauthier. You do not call the investors. You do not do anything that looks like what your father would have done." Silence. "Killian, I heard you. Say it back to me." A pause so long she thought he would push back. "Then counsel first, disclosure. No calls. And if the inspector comes before you file? Then you let me handle the site review," she said. "And you get me independent engineers and a paper trail so clean it makes the inspectors boring. You're not supposed to be doing any of this. I'm aware. You could walk away. This isn't your problem." She looked at the files on her laptop, at the Gauthier number in the corner of the invoice, at Gerta's address in the South Block, which she had written on a sticky note 2 months ago and which was still on the wall beside her desk. "People use paperwork to take things from people who don't know how to read it," she said. "I know how to read it." She paused. "That's the entire reason I got into this field. So no, I'm not walking away." He was quiet for a moment in a way that was not nothing. "Send me the rest of the files," she said. "I'll have the full map by Friday." She did. It was 22 pages. She printed it in the library on Saint-Denis because her printer had given up 2 months ago and she had not replaced it yet. She carried the pages in a folder on the bus to Voss and Partners and walked through the lobby and into the elevator without stopping and pushed open the conference room door on 3. Killian was there. Renaud was there. 2 lawyers she had not met and one she recognized as the firm's senior partner. A woman named Archambault who looked at Norah the way certain people look at things that have appeared in the wrong category. Norah set the folder on the table. She said, "The money isn't moving through Voss, it's moving around it, through the subcontractors. Here," she pulled the first page, "and here, and through Gauthier's holding to this numbered account which connects to 2 of the original investors your father brought in from the port partnerships in 2011. Archambault leaned forward. Renaud picked up the second page. One of the lawyers she hadn't met took off his glasses. Norah kept going. She was not going to stop until someone told her she was wrong, and nobody did. Killian stood at the side of the room with his arms crossed. He did not interrupt. He watched her work the room the way someone watches a thing they had suspected existed and are now seeing for the first time. By the end of it, Archibald had a yellow legal pad full of notes. One lawyer was already on his phone. Renaud was building a second map on the whiteboard from Norah's pages, drawing lines she named and connecting them to companies she had found by following bad habits in tax ID numbers. Killian said, "What do you need?" "Full access to the subcontractor files, your external auditor." She paused. "And the city inspector's schedule." He nodded. Renaud nodded. Archibald looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Where did you train?" "McGill," Norah said, "and 3 years of people bringing me their landlord's paperwork in a room with 4 chairs and a plant." Archibald's expression shifted, not softened, recalibrated. They filed the voluntary disclosure 4 days later. The auditor confirmed her numbers within 2. The city inspector arrived, found a site so clean it generated paperwork that made the inspector's report look like a letter of recommendation, and left. Gauthier received a call from Archibald that Norah was not in the room for, but whose outcome appeared the following week in the form of a retraction of services and a document signed in the presence of 3 witnesses. The investors were quieter. The phone calls stopped. Norah heard about most of this from Renaud, who had started sending her brief updates with the energy of someone who had decided she was now part of the operation and was not going to ask anyone's permission for that. She received each update at her desk at the clinic between intake appointments and told no one except Danny, who said, "I told you," with the controlled satisfaction of someone who had been right and was willing to be gracious about it. Killian came to the clinic on a Thursday afternoon. He did not have an appointment. He stood in the waiting room in his coat with the 4 chairs and the plant, and looked at the space the way people look at a room that contains more than it shows. Norah came out of intake and stopped when she saw him. The woman waiting for her appointment looked between them with the mild interest of someone who had seen stranger things in this room, which she almost certainly had. Norah said, "I'll be 1 minute," to the woman, who nodded. She stepped outside with Killian into the November air, which had gotten colder and more sincere about it since the market. "Gauthier is cooperating," Killian said. "Renaud told me. The investors have agreed to a settlement negotiated through council. Renaud told me that too." He looked at her for a moment. "You should be angry. About what?" "About being a target, about the call at 6:53, about being put in the middle of something that wasn't yours." She thought about that. She was not unangry, but anger had never been the primary thing for her. The primary thing was whether the problem was solvable, and it had been. "I'm annoyed about the call," she said. "I'm fine about the rest. You're fine. I'm employed, my cat is alive, and Gerda's curtain is still in the south block window." She paused. "I'm fine." Something moved across his face, not performance. Something that had been held back for a long time and was deciding, carefully, whether it was allowed out. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "You know where I work," she said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him, at the coat, at the controlled stillness that she now understood was not coldness but the cost of spending years, being careful about what you let yourself want, at the man who had changed the plans before he told her he had, and who bought butter at the market, and who had said "I'm sorry" on a phone call in a way that suggested he meant it enough to know it was insufficient. "No car outside my office," she said. "Understood. No having people you know drive past the clinic." He held her gaze. "That was once. Once is noted." His mouth moved. "Noted. And if you decide to buy any building that affects my caseload," she said, "you tell me before the city does." "Agreed." She put her hands in her coat pockets, because the cold had decided to be serious about it, and she had not dressed for a negotiation. "There's a place on Duluth that makes very good soup," she said. "I go on Saturdays. It costs $8, and the tables are small, and it does not have a dress code." Killian Voss, who could have eaten anywhere in Montreal, looked at her with something she was now willing to call gratitude. "What time?" "Noon," she said. "And you pay for your own." She went back inside. Through the window she watched him stand on the sidewalk for a moment, before he turned and walked toward the street. She watered the plant before her next appointment. Months moved through the way Montreal months do, heavy and specific weather that required a plan. Norah kept her apartment, her clinic, her Saturdays. Killian kept his distance, and then, incrementally, less of it. The soup place on Duluth became a standing arrangement. Danny met him once, assessed him in the way of someone completing a professional evaluation, and afterwards said only, "He asks you questions and then actually listens to the answers. That's rarer than it should be." He told her about his father. Not all of it. Enough. A man who had believed that a clean balance sheet meant a clean conscience, and who had used the balance sheet the way other men used silence, to make it impossible for anyone to say exactly what was wrong. Killian had spent his childhood learning which rooms were safe before he understood why some weren't. He had inherited the firm at 31 and spent the next 4 years taking it apart invoice by invoice, trying to understand which parts of it could be kept and which could not. The greenhouse helps, Norah said. This was not a metaphor. He had a greenhouse on the upper floor of his building on De la Montagne. She had seen it twice by then. Herbs and tomato plants and a lemon tree he had brought up from a nursery in the eastern townships, and which required more maintenance than most people required of relationships. It grows if I do the work, he said. It doesn't negotiate. Everything negotiates, she said. Plants just do it slowly enough that people mistake it for compliance. He looked at her. That might be the most accountant's sentence I've heard outside a conference room. Thank you. The disclosure process ran for 7 months. The investors' names appeared in documents that moved through courts quietly, the way these things moved when all parties had agreed. It was better to be boring than to be a headline. Gauthier lost his license. 2 numbered companies were dissolved. The LaJoie development moved forward with a revised subcontractor list and a community liaison agreement that the city held up, once, as an example of how these things could be done. Gerda's curtain was still there. Norah's clinic got a mention in the community report as a contributing organization. Her director bought a cake. Serge ate most of it and talked about real estate. She quit in January, not because she had to, because the clinic's board, after a process that Danny described as basically inevitable from about 4 months ago, offered her a position that was new, which meant she could design it, which meant she could make it the thing she had been doing informally for 3 years. Forensic intake, which was not a category that existed yet, but which turned out to be needed urgently enough that the funding came through in 6 weeks. She signed the paperwork on a Wednesday morning. Afterward, she took the long way to the bus, past the LaJoie block. The laundrette was still there. The dépanneur, the upper windows with their lights, the south corner with the yellow curtain, in the window of a unit where a woman named Gerda had lived for 31 years and was, as far as Norah could determine from the outside, still living. Killian met her for lunch. Not at the soup place. At a restaurant that cost more than $8, which she had agreed to once, on the grounds that once was not a pattern. He told her over bad timing and good bread that he was finalizing the sale of 3 properties inherited from his father's earliest partnerships, properties he had never been able to use cleanly and had spent years not knowing what to do with. It cost more than I expected, he said. Money or otherwise? Otherwise. He looked at the table. My father built things believing they would outlast him. Some of them have. The ones that outlast him in the wrong way are the hardest to let go of. Not because I want them, because letting go means accepting what they were. Norah thought about a housing file she had worked 18 months ago. A family who had been told their building was code compliant for a decade, which was technically true in the way that certain truths are worse than lying. You can't clean the past, she said. You can only decide what you build on top of it. He looked at her. That's not a metaphor, she said. I mean it practically. You are literally building on land with a history. The history doesn't disappear, but what goes up matters. I know, he said. That's why I want you involved in the next one. She looked at him. Which one? He told her. It was not the largest project on the firm's books. It was a block in Point St. Charles where 4 buildings were sitting empty, condemned, and where the city had been trying to find a developer willing to work with an existing community land trust rather than around it. Every other developer had declined. The numbers were harder. The process was slower. The land trust had very good lawyers who had seen every trick in the development playbook and had written formal responses to all of them. Killian had called the land trust the week before. He had asked what they needed, and, Norah said, they need someone they trust inside the development process, he said. Someone who understands their documentation and who won't disappear when the project gets complicated. She set down her fork. You're asking me to work for you. I'm asking you to consult on a project I think you'd find worth your time. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm asking you to work with me. There's a difference. She thought about that. She thought about the difference between rooms she had been invited into, and rooms she had walked into by accident, and rooms she had walked into by choice, and what each kind felt like from the inside. I want to meet the land trust first, she said. Of course, and I won't sign anything that limits my ability to tell you when you're wrong. I wouldn't expect you to, and if I find something in the financials I don't like, You tell me before anyone else. She picked up her fork. I'll look at the documentation. He nodded. No performance, no elaborate gratitude. Just the look of a man who had learned, late and with effort, that the right answer to someone trusting you was to be worthy of it, rather than to make a lot of noise about how much it meant. She looked at the bread. You can order the good bread, she said, since we're already past the $8 threshold. His mouth curved. Thank you for the dispensation, don't push it. The Point St. Charles project took 2 years. Norah was not involved in every meeting. She was involved in every meeting that mattered, which was a distinction the land trust's lawyers appreciated, and which Killian understood without being told. There were fights, good ones. The kind that ended with better documents rather than wounded silences. The kind where someone said something true and inconvenient, and the other person said nothing for a moment and then revised their position, because they had gotten used to the idea that revision was not failure. The buildings opened on a Tuesday in October. Norah was there. So was Killian, who stood at the back of the gathered crowd and watched the land trust director speak about what the space would mean, and who looked, for the first time in any public situation Norah had observed, like a man who was simply present without needing to manage what that presence cost him. She stood beside him, not in front, not behind, beside. Afterward, walking back along the canal, he said, My father would not have recognized this as success. What would he have recognized? A loss. He was quiet for a moment. He would have been right that we made less than we could have, and wrong about what that means. Yes, he glanced at her. Yes. They walked the rest of the way without talking, which by then had become one of the things she trusted most about him. He did not fill space with noise. He let silence be what it was, which was sometimes difficult and sometimes simply companionable, and sometimes the only honest container for something that did not have words yet. They stopped at the corner where her street met the canal walk. The October air had done what October in Montreal does, which has become indistinguishable from November's preliminary draft. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. I'm going to do it badly, he said. I know that in advance. Do it anyway. He looked at her. I've spent most of my adult life knowing that the things I built came from ground I didn't choose. I've been trying to decide for a long time whether a man can build something worth keeping when his foundation was built by someone else's methods. He paused. I think he can. I think I have. But I don't think I'd have been able to see that without someone who read the plans differently than I did. Norah said nothing. I'm not asking you to give up anything, he said. Your work, your clinic, your Saturdays, the soup place, any of it. A pause. I'm asking if you'd want to keep building alongside someone who is trying badly and with difficulty to be worth the asking. The canal was doing what canals do in October, which was look old and cold and entirely unconcerned with the conversations being held beside it. Somewhere behind them, a cyclist went past on the path and said something in Quebecois that was either a greeting or a commentary, and moved on before it mattered which. Norah had spent a long time understanding the difference between rooms she had been placed in and rooms she had chosen. She understood her own answers best when she stopped preparing for them and simply noticed what they were. You should know, she said, that I still have the notepad from the morning of that phone call. I know. I keep it, she said, because I wrote down what he said, but also because I wrote down your number underneath it, and I noticed that I put your number there in better handwriting than his. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Is that a yes? It's a notarized yes, she said, with a paper trail. The winter that followed was the kind Montreal specializes in, which is to say uncompromising, specific and beautiful in ways that required you to be outside in it to understand. Norah was outside in it often, which had always been true, and now occasionally accompanied, which was new, and which she found, to her own mild surprise, that she had been ready for longer than she knew. The lemon tree in his greenhouse produced fruit that second winter. She was the one who noticed. He said he had been waiting for it quietly for 2 seasons. She told him that patience was an accounting skill, and he said he was beginning to understand that. And she laughed in the warm air among the herbs and the tomato vines and the small improbable life that a man had kept growing above a city that did not know it was there. Outside, Montreal was being itself, loud and cold and full of people making decisions in small apartments and big boardrooms and 4-chair waiting rooms with plants that somebody watered. Inside, the numbers balanced.